Have you ever looked up at the stars or just, seen how reliably the seasons change and thought, wow, there's this incredible order in the universe?
Mm-hmm. It definitely feels like there's a system.
But then you look at, well, us, human life, and it often seems so chaotic, full of conflict, injustice. It feels kind of out of step, doesn't it?
It really does. And that contrast is exactly what we're diving into today. We're looking at a source that tackles this very question. It offers a pretty surprising perspective.
Okay, welcome everyone to the deep dive.
Today we're exploring the core ideas from a historical lecture. It's titled A Twent a So, which translates roughly to The Way of Peace.
And this isn't something recent, right?
No, not at all. The source itself says it's based on a public lecture given way back in May 1940. And it was for a mixed audience, so the aim was clarity.
Right, context is key. The source mentions the goal was to explain a really fundamental concept, the oneness of God, or Tayed using simple language.
Exactly. Using common examples people could relate to address what were, even then, pressing world problems. Things like insecurity, injustice, and linking them back to this central idea.
So our mission today for this deep dive is basically to unpack the main arguments from this lecture. What insights can we pull out about, the human condition and maybe a path to peace, at least as this author saw it?
Let's get into it. So the starting point for the source is quite fundamental. It asserts that complex systems, well, they don't just happen. They need a maker, an operator, someone in charge.
Okay, makes sense. How does it build that case?
It uses some really straightforward analogies first, things from everyday life before getting to the big picture of the universe. The basic idea is you wouldn't believe a complicated thing just runs itself.
Like what kind of things?
Well, the source asks you to imagine, say, a shop. Could it just appear, run itself? No owner, nobody's stocking shelves, nobody's selling.
No, that sounds absurd.
Or a factory just springing into existence, machines building themselves, operating perfectly with no engineers, no mechanics, nothing.
Okay, I see the point. You wouldn't accept that.
And it pushes it even further. Like, would you believe an electric bulb just decides to produce light on its own? Or a chair assembles itself? Clothes weave themselves. Houses just build themselves.
Definitely not. So if we don't accept that for simple stuff.
Exactly. How can we apply totally different logic to the immense complexity of the cosmos? The source paints this picture of a tremendous factory, planets, stars, all moving like clockwork.
It mentions things like the water cycle too, right? Evaporation, clouds,
Yeah.
rain.
Or how plants grow from what seems like dead earth, producing all this diversity. The source sees that as needing an explanation.
And it drills down into the human body specifically.
It does. It points out we're made of basic elements, stuff that's chemically quite simple, worth maybe just a few rupees, as the text puts it.
But you can't just mix them together and get a living person.
Right. Science can't assemble a living, sensing, thinking human being that way. The source argues it's impossible just by, random mixing.
There's a really striking part about creation in the womb, too.
Yeah, I call the womb a small factory. These microscopic organisms develop over 9 months into a complete human. Eyes, ears, brain, everything perfectly placed. Life, consciousness, abilities, all added.
And then expelled by the same factory.
And the source really hammers on the uniqueness. Billions born, yet every single person is distinct. Looks, voice, talents, personality. Even siblings are different.
It calls this individuality a miracle.
It does. And the text argues that seeing all this complexity, this design, this uniqueness, and still denying a creator, one who is described as wise, powerful, knowledgeable, perfect, well, the source suggests that points to a kind of defect in thinking.
So conclusion number 1 from the source. Based on observing complexity and order, denying a creator is presented as fundamentally illogical.
Okay, so if the source establishes the existence of a creator, the next logical step it takes is about the oneness of that creator, Tawhid.
So moving from there is one to there is only one.
Precisely. And the core premise shifts slightly here. Now it's orderly systems require a single authority. One boss.
Does it use analogies for this too?
Oh yeah. Back to the everyday examples. Can a school function properly with 2 headmasters, both giving different orders?
Sounds like chaos.
Or an army with 2 commanders, a government department with 2 directors, a kingdom with 2 kings?
No, that would just fall apart. A constant conflict.
The source basically says it would lead to immediate chaos and failure. It even quotes a proverb, something like, a joint venture pot breaks in the middle of the square. The idea is, any order we see, even in human affairs, relies on a single will, one ultimate authority.
Okay, so how does it apply that to the universe?
It points back to that tremendous factory again. Millions of planets, stars, galaxies, all moving with this incredible regularity, never deviating.
Night and day are predictable. The moon doesn't crash into Earth. The sun doesn't just wander off.
Right. And it's not just the movement. It's the fixed, unchanging laws governing everything. Gravity, air, water, light, heat, cold, the properties of soil, metals, everything operates under consistent rules.
And the source emphasizes cooperation, you said.
Yes, this is a key point. How all these incredibly diverse forces work together, perfectly, constantly. The example it uses is growing a single grain of wheat or a fruit tree from a tiny seed.
Takes a lot working together.
Earth, sun, water, air, the cycles of night and day, they all have to cooperate, follow the rules for months or even years, just for that one seed to become a tree bearing fruit.
Our whole existence depends on that kind of cooperation.
Absolutely. The source argues that human life itself relies on countless different forces working together in perfect harmony, obeying these fixed laws. It suggests you couldn't even make something simple like a needle if the underlying forces refuse to cooperate.
So this perfect, enduring order and cooperation
is presented as overwhelming evidence. Proof, the source argues, that there can only be one ruler, one ultimate king of the entire universe, one single authority whose law binds everything together.
If there were multiple gods, the source claims,
there would inevitably be conflict, disagreement, disorder. Such perfect, long-lasting regularity and harmony would simply be impossible. Authority, the text insists, must rest with only one.
It adds another layer, too, about knowledge.
Yes, that true rule requires more than just power. It needs vast, all-encompassing knowledge, the ability to see and understand the entire system, all its parts, all its needs, all at once.
Which, according to the source, only God possesses.
Exactly. Granting authority to beings without that complete knowledge, beings who are part of the system, not above it, would inevitably ruin it. Like letting an amateur try to operate a hugely complex machine.
And this leads to a pretty strong conclusion about divinity.
It does. The source argues that the cosmos not only has one maker, but one ruler. And the very nature of creation dictates that nothing created can logically be a partner in divinity. It's presented as illogical, contrary to reality, nature, and truth.
So no created being, no matter how powerful or knowledgeable they might seem from a human perspective,
can have any share in God's authority or divinity. The relationship is framed strictly as creator and created, ruler and ruled. Any other setup is deemed fundamentally flawed from this perspective.
Okay, so the source has built its case.
Yeah.
One creator, one ruler, governing everything by his law. Now, how does it connect this to, well, us, to human life?
Right, that's the pivot. If we live within this perfectly ordered, divinely ruled system, why is human life often so? Not ordered, not peaceful.
The source acknowledges that contrast head on.
Absolutely. It observes that while the rest of creation seems to operate in peace and follow its designated function, human life is rife with suffering, conflict, injustice, oppression, corruption, division, lack of trust, humans hurting each other. It asks point blank, why is humanity deprived of peace?
And the answer gives.
It's concise and quite stark. Human misery is caused by living contrary to reality, acting against the way things actually are.
Living contrary to reality, what does that mean in practice? It gives an analogy, doesn't it?
A really powerful one. Imagine you're on a fast-moving train. You mistake the train door for the door to your own home. Believing it's your front door, you confidently step out, expecting to be in your courtyard.
Oof, bad idea.
Very bad. Your belief that it's your home door doesn't change the reality that you're stepping out of a speeding train.
The consequences are real, regardless of your mistaken belief. Broken leg, head injury.
Exactly. The source argues that even if you refuse to admit you made a mistake, even if you insist it was your home door, reality doesn't change. The law of gravity, the force of impact, they operate anyway, and you suffer the consequences.
So how does that apply to God and human life?
The source draws a direct parallel. If you believe there's no God, or you decide you are your own God, making your own rules, or you accept other beings or forces as gods alongside or instead of the true creator,
your belief doesn't change the fundamental reality.
That's the argument. According to this text, your belief doesn't alter the fact that God is the sole sovereign, the ultimate reality. The universe remains his kingdom, operating under his laws, whether you acknowledge it or not.
And this is the crucial bit. The way you live, based on that flawed understanding.
That will have consequences. The life you build, the society you create, based on ignoring or defying the actual structure of reality, will inevitably run into problems. It will lead to friction, breakdown, suffering, the very misery the source is trying to explain, even if you don't consciously connect the suffering back to the initial mistake in belief.
The source emphasizes that God's status isn't dependent on our belief.
Not at all. It states God is God by his own power and right. He created you, sustains you, provides everything you depend on. This reality, the text argues, is inescapable.
So accepting this reality versus rejecting it
Makes all the difference, according to the source. Accepting reality and understanding your true status within it leads, the text claims, to a life of peace, satisfaction, and proper functioning. Living contrary to it, like stepping out of that train door, inevitably leads to damage and suffering.
Okay, so if living according to reality is key, the source then asks directly, well, what is our correct status within that reality?
Exactly. It addresses the listener you directly. Given this framework of a single creator king, what's your actual position?
And it uses more analogies here, right, to define that relationship.
Several of them. Creator and created. He made you, so your nature is to follow his will, his design.
Like a machine following its maker's instructions.
Sort of. Or employer and employee. He sustains you, gives you everything you need to live and work, so you are his servant, obligated to obey his commands.
Okay, what else?
Officer and subordinate. He's the ultimate superior. You are his subordinate. King and subject. The universe is his kingdom. You are his subject, bound by his law. Owner and property. Everything, including you, is his property. His will must prevail.
These are very clear hierarchical relationships.
They are, and they lead to a very strong conclusion in the text about human claims to sovereignty or authority.
Which is
That absolutely no human, not an individual, not a family, not a class, not a nation, not a parliament, not any government or council, has any right whatsoever to claim ultimate kingship or sovereignty.
no right to make their own laws independent of God's law.
Precisely. Or to demand absolute obedience from others, from God's subjects, as if they were the ultimate authority. The source frames any such claim as illegitimate.
And disobeying God's actual law or obeying human laws that contradict God's law
Is defined explicitly by the source as rebellion, Gadari, treason against the true king of the universe.
that's strong language. Rebellion.
Very strong. And the source doesn't shy away from spelling out the perceived consequences. It argues you cannot escape God's grip, his power, anywhere in his vast kingdom. He can seize you anytime, anywhere.
And there will be accountability.
Yes. The text paints this picture of a future moment where you, individually, will be brought before God and questioned directly.
Questioned about what specifically?
Things like, you were my subject. Where did you get the right to become the ruler in my kingdom? You were my servant. Why did you serve others instead of me? This was my property. Where did you derive the authority to enforce your will here?
Wow. And the source asks rhetorically.
If you have any answer to that charge.
Yeah.
It suggests that no human lawyer, no powerful connection, no excuse will save you from the consequences of what it defines as this crime of rebellion against the rightful sovereign.
Okay, so there's the argument about rightful authority. But the source also links human misery to the quality of human governance, right? Not just its legitimacy.
Yes, absolutely. It argues that even setting aside the rebellion aspect, human misery also flows directly from the fact that humans try to run things when they aren't actually qualified to do so.
How does it explain that lack of qualification?
It uses that analogy again, the one about the complex machine. If an amateur tries to drive a car or operate complex machinery without understanding it, they'll ruin it, right?
Sure, makes sense.
So the source asks, how can humans, who it claims don't even fully understand themselves, let alone the complexities of other people, society, and the countless problems of life, how can they possibly succeed in running this incredibly intricate machine of human existence?
They're bound to mess it up, essentially.
That's the argument. And the source identifies a core reason why human attempts at governance inevitably lead to injustice. What's the fundamental flaw it sees?
It says humans are inherently partial, biased.
Exactly. Fundamentally partial, self-interested, limited in perspective.
And it gives examples of how this plays out.
Yes, quite vividly. It points to historical and societal patterns. Kings, for instance, who declare themselves sacred or above the law, living in luxury off their subjects' labor, demanding reverence despite their own flaws.
And privileged classes.
Right. Groups like Brahmins or peers in some contexts, nobles, chiefs, landlords, moneylenders. The source suggests these groups often create laws and social systems that grant themselves excessive rights and diminish the status and rights of others. Their own interests and desires become paramount.
Prioritizing themselves over the lives, wealth, and honor of ordinary people.
And it extends this to nations. Ruling nations, subjugating others, viewing themselves as superior, maybe even the only true humans, and creating laws that serve their own national interests at the direct expense of the people they rule.
So according to the source, this isn't just accidental, it stems from a fundamental limitation.
Yes, the source argues that human decision makers, whether individuals or groups, are inevitably dominated by concern for their own self, their family, their race, their class, their nation. They lack sufficient knowledge, breadth of vision, and, crucially, selfless sympathy for the rights and needs of all others. They are inherently biased.
And because of this inherent bias, human-made law inevitably leads to
injustice, oppression, conflict. Therefore, the source proposes a pretty radical solution from his perspective.
which is
To discard all human-made laws and systems of ultimate authority and instead accept the law of God.
why God's law specifically.
Because, the source argues, in God's eyes and in his law, there is no inherent distinction between human beings based on race, nationality, class, family, or color. The only basis for distinction, it claims, is piety, character, and deeds. This, the source asserts, is the only foundation for true justice.
Okay, so accepting God's supreme authority and his law is presented as the way to overcome human bias and injustice. How does the source connect this to achieving actual peace?
It brings in another crucial element here, the concept of accountability, a sense of being answerable to someone higher.
How does that create peace?
The argument is this: without the belief in and fear of a higher power, one who sees everything, knows everything, and has the ultimate power to punish individuals, families, classes, nations, they become unrestrained.
Like wolves among sheep was the phrase used.
Exactly. They become oppressive, exploitative, because there's no ultimate check on their power or desires. The source claims that a huge amount of the insecurity and conflict in the world stems directly from this lack of accountability to a power above humanity.
And can't humans create systems of accountability, like international courts or organizations?
The source argues, no, not effectively. Because any human or human group put in that position of ultimate judge or enforcer is itself prone to the same limitations: bias, self-interest, partiality. They can become oppressors too.
It mentioned the League of Nations as an example.
Yes, it points to the League of Nations, which was intended to prevent conflict, but which the source claims quickly became dominated by powerful nations and acted unjustly towards weaker ones, proving its point that human institutions can't provide that ultimate impartial check.
So if humans can't do it, the only power capable of truly restraining everyone and ensuring accountability is
Outside and above humanity. It must be a power that isn't subject to human limitations. And according to the source, only God's power fits this description. He sees all, knows all, is perfectly just, and has ultimate power.
Therefore, the path to real lasting peace, according to this text,
Involves three core things. First, believing in this one God. Second, consciously submitting to him as obedient subjects, accepting his rule and his law. And third, living with the absolute certainty, yaqeen, that he is aware of every single action, open or hidden, and that everyone will be held accountable in his court after death.
living in that constant awareness of divine oversight and future judgment.
Yes, the source posits that this framework, belief, obedience, and accountability to God, is the only way for human beings to develop true nobility, selflessness, justice, and ultimately peace, both internal peace and peace in society.
Okay, but then there's a pretty obvious question, isn't there? If God is this all-powerful king, and humans are openly, rebelling according to this source, setting up their own rules, ignoring his laws, why is that even possible? Why doesn't he just stop it, punish them immediately?
That's a very natural doubt, and the source anticipates it directly. If God's rule is supreme, why does rebellion seem to flourish? Why the delay in judgment?
How does it answer that? It uses another analogy, I believe.
It does. An analogy of a king who appoints an officer, say a governor, to manage a district or province. Now, the king retains all ultimate power, right? He could intervene anytime.
Sure.
But for a specific purpose, he deliberately loosens his grip a bit. He steps back slightly, doesn't constantly micromanage or display his overwhelming power immediately.
Why would he do that?
To test the officer's loyalty, his capability, his true character, and also to test the intelligence and discernment of the subjects in that district. Will they recognize the true authority or be fooled by the temporary power of the local officer?
So it's a trial period, and there are two possible outcomes in this scenario.
Exactly. Outcome 1. The officer is loyal and capable, and the subjects are intelligent. They understand the situation, remain dutiful to the king, follow his laws even though his grip seems loose, and thus prove their worthiness. They'll likely be rewarded later.
And outcome too.
The officer is foolish and disloyal. Sensing the loosened grip, seeing the immediate power he wields, police, courts, administration, he gets arrogant, forgets the king, and declares himself the independent ruler of the district.
And the subjects.
The ignorant or short-sighted subjects might be impressed by this visible, immediate power. They see the officer's authority right there while the king is distant. So they start obeying the rebellious officer, following his rules, thinking he's the real deal.
Okay, so how does this relate back to God? The king in the analogy is God.
Yes, the source says God sees this rebellion, humans claiming sovereignty, making their own laws, people following them. He absolutely could crush it in an instant. His power is overwhelming.
But he doesn't. Why the patience?
It's described not as weakness, but as tolerance and deliberation. He allows them time, maybe years, generations, for the full extent of their disloyalty, their arrogance, their ignorance, their capacity for mischief and injustice to become completely manifest.
To let them fully show their true colors, so to speak.
Exactly. The source argues God isn't threatened by this rebellion. The rebels are ultimately weak, completely dependent on him, and cannot escape his domain. He knows he can seize them whenever he wills.
So the delay isn't indifference or inability.
But rather, it serves the purpose of a full and fair trial, to allow all the evidence of rebellion and its consequences to accumulate, leaving no doubt about the justice of the eventual sentence when it inevitably comes, at a time only he determines.
And bringing this back to the listener, to you.
The source concludes this point by saying, you are currently in this period of testing. Your intellect, your judgment, your loyalty, your ability to discern reality from illusion, it's all being put to the test right now within this framework.
Wow. That's quite a framing of human existence.
It definitely is. The source essentially argues that this life is that trial period, the time given by the king before the final reckoning.
So to recap our deep dive today, we've journeyed through this historical source's arguments, starting with why it believes the universe points to a single creator.
Based on complexity and order. Then moving to the argument for the oneness of that creator, based on the need for a single authority for harmony and function.
Then we looked at its explanation for human suffering and conflict, essentially, living contrary to the reality of God's sovereignty, like stepping off that moving train.
Right. And its definition of our true status as created beings, subjects within his kingdom, which leads to its view on the illegitimacy of human claims to ultimate authority and lawmaking.
We also explored why it argues human-made laws inevitably lead to injustice because of inherent human partiality and limitations.
And how it sees true peace as achievable only through belief, obedience, and a strong sense of accountability to God.
Finally, addressing that key doubt, why rebellion seems possible and punishment isn't immediate, using the analogy of the king testing his subjects and officers during a trial period.
Throughout all this, the core message coming from this particular text is pretty consistent. The solution to humanity's problems, the path to peace and justice, lies in aligning human life individually and collectively with what it presents as the fundamental reality of God's singular sovereignty and his divine law.
And it leaves you, the listener, with a really stark choice, doesn't it? Framed entirely within its own perspective, of course.
It does. It basically says, given this reality, will you choose to be a loyal servant and subject to the true king? Or will you align yourself with those who, in its view, are rebelling against him, impressed by their temporary worldly power?
And it adds that crucial reminder from its viewpoint. Understand that whichever path you choose, according to this text, there are definite and inescapable consequences that come directly from God himself. You're free to choose, but not free from the consequences.
It certainly gives you a lot to think about, regardless of your own beliefs. A very distinct framework for understanding the world and our place in it.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into what is undeniably a fascinating and thought-provoking historical source.
Yes, thanks for exploring these complex ideas with us. We appreciate you tuning in.
We'll be back again soon to dive deep into another set of intriguing sources. See you then.